The scientific study of the human mind and behaviour, psychology. But just how scientific, if at all, is psychology? This is an important question, the answer to which determines whether any of its findings can be called scientifically valid, that is to say, an accurate representation of reality, the truth. The modern definition of science is the study of the structure and behaviour of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. Now, a lot of psychological research does claim to use this method in its approach. Observation, experiment, these are certainly apt descriptions for how most psychologists do psychology. A lot of the methods and data certainly look scientific. The issue isn't that they're doing science wrong, rather what they're doing it to. The physical and natural world. Is that really what psychologists are measuring? Take Bandura's study of transmission of aggression in children. Okay, yeah, the children are real, the dolls they're being made to hit are real, but he's not measuring the children or the dolls, he's measuring aggression. But how real is aggression? Though psychology is commonly depicted with a picture of a brain, this is not really accurate as psychology is actually the study of the mind. But how real is the mind? There is a huge gap between the mind and the brain, and here lies the problem. Science claims to be the study of the physical and natural world, but whilst the brain fits into this category, the mind does not. To fully understand the complications that arise from calling psychology a science, you first got to understand the concept of the explanatory gap. The explanatory gap refers to the irreconcilable space between creations and discoveries. The brain, for example, is a discovery. It's a tangible object that can be measured and observed, and the physical activity inside a brain can be reliably examined through things like an MRI. The mind is a creation. It's an abstract concept we use to refer to what's going on inside the brain as related to our own experience and understanding of consciousness. Though, even saying the mind is inside the brain is giving too much weight to the idea of the mind as a discovery that you can observe and measure, as you are granting it the assumption of a physical location. In reality, the mind has no physical location, no measurable qualities or attributes. It's what's known as a human kind. Put simply, we made it up. Questions like, where is the mind, may sound ridiculous, but they're worth thinking about. If you can't even locate the thing you are measuring, can you really measure it? In fact, you could even take this further and argue that the brain is still a concept in itself. The mere act of arbitrarily separating it from the rest of the body is a decision on the part of humans. The way we conceptualize it as being the logical organ, for example, use your brain, whereas the heart is used to refer to the irrational parts of the mind. Even this is a sort of creation, and the brain could still be seen as a humankind in this way. But the difference between the brain and the mind is, though the connotations surrounding it can change, the brain, as we have distinguished it, is what it is regardless of what we call it. The existence of the physical, squishy ball of neurons encased in a human skull cannot be altered by our language. It is indifferent to it. The mind, however, is entirely contingent on language, rendering it not indifferent, but interactive. Okay, so maybe the brain can't really tell us much about the mind, but what about studying behaviour? It's true that studying behaviour eliminates the explanatory gap in a way, but how we perceive certain behaviours is still entirely dependent on our time and place, our culture, our language, our experience, all of which means there can still be no valid or reliable findings. You only have to look at the history of mental illness to realise that the language has a constructive power that is often overlooked in psychology. Hysteria became mania, which became schizophrenia or bipolar, depending on the psychiatrist, each label bringing with it new symptoms, new treatments, and new social stigmas. Paraphilia was a term used to refer collectively to paedophilia and homosexuality. Homosexuality has been referred to under labels such as sexual deviance, perversion. It's been a crime, a mental illness, a lifestyle choice, and so on. This is why you could say that something like homosexuality hasn't even always existed. Sure, same-sex attraction has, but homosexuality? That's a thing in itself. The same could be said for ADHD. The fact that one of the symptoms is restless in the classroom, when classrooms as we know them are fairly recent and not an invention that crosses all cultures, shows that ADHD, while sometimes useful as a category, has been created by people. There is no blood test for ADHD, no objective way of knowing. It's just words. How you talk about it changes what it is. If everyone says you've got ADHD, you've got it. Advocates of psychology may say, okay, fine, on a philosophical level, yeah, the mind is not the brain, and obviously there are still debates that need to be had. But this is all just a little pedantic, and it's easy to take the nothing is real approach. Psychologists know what they're referring to when they use words like memory and depression. We have enough common ground to pursue further knowledge of these things in a scientific way. Well, do you? Really? A main argument used by psychologists is that they're onto something, they just need more time, that the answers are out there, we just need to keep going, keep refining. And yeah, of course it's easy for me to rip into a discipline that's only 100 years old. It would sound reasonable to argue that, given time, psychology will improve and yield results that can be deemed scientific. I mean, didn't Plato think it was atoms flying off objects into our eyes that allowed us to see, and we later learnt that this was in fact light? Yeah, true, but Plato's musings about atoms was not early physics in action. It was simply the ponderings of an early philosopher. It was philosophy. There was no science involved. Anyway, as soon as we found out that we see because of reflected light, any notion of atoms flying off objects was disregarded. The new logic replaced the now redundant old logic. This has never happened in psychology. The emergence of behaviorism did not disprove psychoanalysis. The emergence of cognitive theory did not disprove behaviorism, and the emergence of neuroscience did not disprove cognitive theory. And while some psychologists may say, just because a new paradigm doesn't silence the last one, that doesn't mean we haven't built on it, improved it. Well, in other areas, such as the humanities, you may have a point. But in psychology, which claims to be a science, new paradigms don't really build on previous ones, they reject them. None of these paradigms fit together at all, which is why I don't put any stock in the idea of psychology as a young science. You've got Freud analysing his own dreams, Pavlov ringing bells at dogs, Bandura trying to teach aggression with dolls, all of these people claiming to be analysing some structure that exists, but with no agreement on what that structure even is. Is it innate urges and desires that we're all born with? Is it learned behaviour during childhood? Is it genetics? Are we conditioned? Should memory be presented as a flowchart, a graph, Lego bricks, a compost heap? The truth is, psychology undergoes a major paradigm shift about every 10 years. All the way to 2019, where we're putting people in MRI scanners and showing them pictures and saying, oh, that part of the brain lit up when we showed them this, that must mean something. The presence of scientific equipment does not make this any more scientific than Freud analysing his own dreams. This is how detached the different psychological approaches are, and how the notion of psychology as one thing, let alone one science, is completely ludicrous.